Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Innovation Policy Lab webinar on the topic of does Canada have an effective innovation policy, a subject that is very near and dear to our hearts at IPL. We're fortunate today to have two presenters with us, Shirley Anne Scharf and Travis Southen. And we have one of those rare coincidences where the two of them were working on Ph.D. theses on a similar topic at two different universities at the same time, and were well into their work before either of them knew the other one was doing the same topic. Shirley Anne at Ottawa U and Travis at the University of Toronto. So I thought it would be really, the time frames are slightly different. Shirley Anne covered the period 2000 to 2020, Travis 2015 to 2021. The analytical frameworks they used are slightly different, but not too surprisingly, the conclusions are not that dissimilar. So I thought it would be quite interesting to ask each of them to present the key insights and findings from their respective theses. They will present for about 15 minutes each, will be followed by a question and answer period. And as usual with Monk and IPL webinars, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write out your questions. And I will, when Shirley Anne and Travis have finished presenting, I will moderate the questions and read the questions out for each of them. So with no further ado, I'd like to get right into the main event. And Shirley Anne, why don't you take over the screen and present your research insights and findings to us.
Thank you, David. So Canadian innovation policy, the continuing challenge. Really, since Confederation, the issue of strengthening Canada's economic and industrial base has been with us. But in the last 20 years or so, the issue of innovation has taken on new import. So in that context, the focus of this work has been why, as Canadian, and specifically federal public policy, since 2000 seemingly been unable to increase national research and development investment and positively impact Canada's rate of innovation. The theoretical framework I used has been drawn from the developmental network state literature, most associated with Block, Keller, and Mazzucato. And there are four key elements: targeted resourcing by the state on nodes ripe for innovation, brokering of alliances among industry, academia, and government, injection of risk-based capital along the innovation continuum, and mission-oriented priority setting, which for the purpose of Canadian context and comparative work, I've changed to policy durability. There are, in fact, based on those pillars, four separate lines of inquiry. Starting in 2000, do we see sustained priority setting and policy durability? Is it accompanied by targeted resourcing? Is there a focus on thickening clusters of innovation? And is there government incentive and particularly late-stage capitalization? So there are notes on the methodology at the end, but covered, as David said, from 2000 to 2020, did about 54 interviews. I used about 34 OECD economic indicators in addition to everything else. So what the indicators show is that it speaks to the truncated nature of innovation over these last 2 decades. From a high in 2001, the key indicators have been on a downward trend, often on a year-over-year basis. Gross domestic expenditure on R&D, business enterprise expenditure on R&D, even financing of business enterprise expenditure by business on a downward trend since 11. Government expenditure and ICT investments. So what we see on a range of indicators that Canada is ranking squarely in this middling territory vis-a-vis other OECD nations. And as a case in point, on the issue of BIRD, business investment intensity, relative to Israel in 2018, our standing was only 18% of Israel's standing on that indicator. Patents show similar trends. One exception, the key exception, is higher education expenditure and investments. But overall, the innovation gap is real and persistent. So as we dive into the 4 lines of inquiry, looked at priority setting. And innovation policy has been a priority through the 2000-2020 period. But there is a tendency with each new political administration to recast priorities anew. The Liberal administration had its focus on building a research capacity for the 21st century, achieving excellence, and catapulting Canada into the top 5 nations for R&D. It was then followed by the Conservative administration mobilizing that science and tech out into the marketplace with about 4 areas of focus at the beginning, but then it expanded to 28 afterwards. The Liberal administration, another wave of 12 priorities with an innovation and skills plan, and now the intent to double BIRD by 2025. So these specific priorities, when you look at it in the throne speeches, appear and then disappear. ICT is a case in point. And in all, we see 21 priorities over this period, overlaid with very ambitious objectives. There have been constants: energy, biosciences, genomics, but generally the interviews I did also reinforced this theme that we need strategic focus and mission in our priority setting. And indeed, one can conclude that the Canadian innovation policy is challenged by fractured policy durability. When you come to targeted resourcing and budgets, in terms of resourcing largesse, it's not insignificant. 211 brings in at $211.5 billion over these years for federal S&T funding. And there are no major jolts with economic cycling. But with different political regimes, you see a pattern of oscillation. The Chrétien-Martin years, this emphasis on world-class research, about 73% of budgets on innovation dedicated to that. The Harper administration now mobilizing into the marketplace, about 66% of the budgets on innovation related to the commercialization aspect. And distinct with these 2 kind of unique legacies in this area, what you see with the Trudeau administration is this bifurcation, and it swings back and forth between basic science and commercialization. So in 2016, 87% of the budget was focused on innovation, on science. By the next year, it was 3%, and on it went. Constants clearly here as well with research infrastructure, genomics, artificial intelligence, physics, and these upstream higher education R&D type investments. And the interviews reinforce these themes as well by a majority on the lack of coordination and a lack of continuity, which both industry and academics found challenging. So if consistency and strategic precision are hallmarks of targeted resourcing, federal resourcing has not fully measured up to that bar. When we come to the issue of thickening innovation networks, it's evident, and it's evident as a priority and a consistent one. And there were institutions mandated for this and resourced: Industry Canada, the NRC, the Tri-Councils, the networks of centers of excellence. The spending, again, was sustained through these years at about $78.8 billion. And there were signs of success. Business has a very robust history in this country compared to other nations of funding higher education R&D. But repeated Statistics Canada surveys of collaboration on innovation among business, academia, and government do not demonstrate gains. And in fact, when the collaboration of the firm is most critical, these numbers drop to 3.1% for universities and 2.9% for government labs. The interviews resonated with this, with the concerns around fragmentation and siloing, but also concerns with certain regional and sectoral exclusions, particularly in the oil and gas field. So what we see here is this disjuncture between policy intent and policy impact. And I would suggest simply more brokering and more money are unlikely to alter that. And finally, we come to the 4th line of inquiry around patient capital. There's been a very strong focus across all political administrations on macroeconomic stability and essentially market framework policies and taxation for freeing investment and small and medium-sized enterprises as engines of growth. But you do see at critical conjunctures and points in this a direct injection of funds and a broadening evolution of those measures, be it the early years with investment in funding for venture capital and startup and early stage, and then a focus on large scale capital. And then finally, most recently, with the Catalyst initiative, a focus on late stage. Again, funding not insignificant, $2.2 billion. And here it's interesting because we do see the impacts on VC, on venture capital. OECD in 2016 indicated that Canada was third after Israel and US on this indicator. Very strong growth, almost 200% on startup venture capital. But the later stage, we really have a big discrepancy with the US, both aggregate size, the size of the firms, and deal size as well, especially over 200 million. The interviews confirmed this aspect, and really, despite these successes, we still have this late stage gap. So I also, to broaden this out, took a deep dive into two case studies: artificial intelligence in the emerging sector or technology, and pharmaceutical manufacturing mature. And I had the advantage of tracing this back to 1987 to give us a window into causal sequencing. They're very different. The Canadian Institute for Advanced Research was really the crucible for artificial intelligence. And what's interesting here is the federal government became engaged with this institute and funding it from 1987 onward. That funding's been stable and it has occurred at critical times. There also was a focus by the federal government on thickening the innovation ecosystem with commercialization vehicles. And there were robust networks of business, academics, and government, including provincial governments, established. So what we see here is policy durability that crosses political boundaries. It's been leavened by the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy in 2017, and as well by the supercluster scales AI. But there's evidence here, which is really critical, of this more sustained mission, which is unique in the Canadian context. And the indicators point this out. AI patent applications have experienced steady growth over the period studied, and venture capital investments in AI, Canada's ranked 5th among 38 nations. Now, there are concerns by the Naylor report, the Council of Canadian Academies, we're losing our lead in AI, in addition to strategic and enabling technologies more generally. But still, there's overall evidence of positive implications. As one person said about the whole area about AI, yeah, it's been an overnight 40-year success. Pharmaceutical is really the opposite. You saw this unique entente in 87, where in exchange for patent protection, pharma companies were going to invest more in R&D. But after 2000, we do not see an equivalent entente or effort to forge this commitment to R&D investment. Targeting resourcing, it shows really a rupture after 2006, with, I would say, the exception of genomics. And in terms of thickening the innovation ecosystem, in 2007, some very interesting centers of excellence for research and commercialization were rolled out. Were quite successful and had a number of medical related centers within that. These were rolled up in 2018, almost all to have been terminated by 21. And I looked at the work a little later, initiatives that rolled out do not in large show continuity with these past initiatives and centers. So the indicators, no surprise, expenditures on a downward trend below 1988, and patent applications precipitously drop off by about 85%. So you see this shallow nature of the overarching strategy, but fields of research prowess. So what's the conclusion? Why the continuing challenge around Canadian federal innovation policy. So going back to the original pillars and questions, policy durability is fractured with ever-growing number of priorities and overlaid with exceedingly ambitious, and I would suggest sometimes unrealistic targets. Federal resourcing, largesse, but this oscillation between research and commercialization. Thickening of networks, policy intent, but we don't see the policy pull. And with capitalization, evidence of change, but still the concern with late stage. And the pharma cases and the AI case bear this out. So over 20 years, Canada has been well served by an enduring and vibrant core of upstream research activities. But federal innovation policy has not successfully addressed the innovation gap. Policy needs to be durable, directed, strategic, and attentive to performance in problem areas. And in recent years, the parlance has been, it requires a circuit breaker with these historic trends. I would suggest as well that we are now, as we emerge from the pandemic, in a kind of open time where there may be room for that seismic shift that's needed to reckon with these historic challenges. So thank you. And at the end, this is where the thesis can be accessed for those who might be interested. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Shirley Anne. That was great. Without further ado, I will switch over to Travis, ask you to share your slides on the screen and go right into your presentation.
Okay, here we are. Okay. So thank you for organizing, everyone, and for inviting me. So overcoming barriers to policy change, the politics of Canada's innovation policy. So this comes out of the thesis work, as David mentioned, and the agenda today very quickly is to set the scene for this puzzle that the thesis explores, which is innovation policy in Canada, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and why. And explanations that I came to through field work and interviews with policymakers and others are these three institutional barriers that make it difficult to change, to reorient Canada's innovation policy mix. So very quickly, this is a screen grab from David Waters and Omar Kaya, and it's just a great illustration. So gross expenditure in R&D as a country, that's a business sector, government, and higher education, is steadily falling behind an increasing target of the OECD average. And all the way along, we've had repeated attempts at policy reform. And so this kind of sets that natural question is, we can't seem to get this innovation policy correct. We keep trying to change it. And that's that cycling that Shirley Anne spoke of. So we see some constant attempts to change, but over time, again, this is just zooming in on the higher education. Canada is outperforming its peers, always has, on R&D, whereas the business sector has always underperformed its peers, and it's a problem that's not getting better. And so that last round of policy reform, the Innovation and Skills Plan in 2017 budget until now, is sort of the case study, the focus that I'm looking at here. And so again, there were some goals that were set, specific goals tied to indicators, but the question of whether there's sufficient tracking of that progress isn't quite clear. I had to manually go and just double check on the progress on these two targets that seem relevant to today's conversation because they hadn't been updated since 2020. First is doubling the number of high growth firms to 28,000, and we're not quite there. We're actually going down according to the latest StatsCan figures at 10,000. And then similarly increasing business expenditures on R&D. We're not quite at that $30 billion goal, nor are we keeping pace with the OECD average, as was shown in the last slide. So this is just kind of an indicator of where are we trying to go, and are we really tracking how we're getting there. So specifically, the conundrum, the puzzle, is if we've had this sustained underperformance, really, why aren't we changing the tools in the toolkit in the innovation policy mix over time? And so there's three different types of policy tools in an innovation policy mix that I'm using to frame this. The first being the choice between indirect instruments such as R&D tax credits, that would be SHRED in the Canadian context, versus grants and contributions, which tend to allow a bit more targeted approach by the policymakers to select sectors and to really see on milestones whether the project is going forward. And the light blue here is tax credits, and the dark blue is direct grants. So we've incrementally moved towards a balance, but we still rely on tax credits a lot more than other innovating nations such as South Korea, Israel, the US. So the question is, why aren't we seeing a more drastic change in the innovation policy tools that we reach for as a country? Similarly, neutral innovation policy tools. So that small proportion of the policy mix that is direct grants and contributions, I tallied up here from 2007 to 2016. And even of that small portion, which is about 25% versus 75% tax credits, even of that, only 40% is actually, 40% of that is still neutral. It's across all sectors. So this is IRAP, for example. It's not a targeted program. It's available across the economy. So we're still not seeing a lot of targeting within those tools that allow that type of targeting. And then supply side is always overemphasized compared to demand side tools such as procurement. So here you see higher education as, where does the government dollars go? Compared to GDP, Canada is putting a lot of money into the R&D sector in higher education as a government. And then on the right-hand side, you see Innovative Solutions Canada, which is sort of the attempt to copy the US SBIR procurement program, has been very slow to lift off since being introduced in the budget 2017. Actually, all of the departmental awards have tallied up to just half of what they're required to spend each year. So very slow uptake across all government departments. So this puzzle. So we've seen these supply side, indirect and neutral tools being deployed decade after decade. What explains that stability? And so that's the question that I explored through these interviews with policymakers. There's another pocket of about 70 interviews with firms that are not shown here. And really the case study is the Innovation and Skills Plan. These three programs, Strategic Innovation Fund, Superclusters, Innovative Solutions Canada, they're all efforts to move on these dimensions. So they're using direct contributions, they're employing them in a bit more of a targeted fashion, start trying to concentrate on areas of strength and promising firms like Superclusters and Strategic Innovation Fund, and then using procurement as a demand side instrument like Innovative Solutions Canada. So the findings is that this effort to reorient the policy mix ran into these three institutional barriers to policy change that have long been documented by scholars of Canadian industrial policy, Atkinson and Coleman being sort of one of the most famous 1989 book, worth reading for sure. So I'll dive into each of these three institutional features that slowed progress on the Innovation and Skills Plan and moving towards the policy mix towards these directions. So the first one, interdepartmental coordination. So there's a lot to take in here, but the key point is that the supply side tools and the demand side tools are housed within different ministries, right? So procurement is PSPC, and then ISED is the sort of traditional R&D funding, NSERC, SHRC, et cetera. And then SHRED is housed within finance. And so to try and reorient these policy mixes the way ISED tried to initiate during the last transition in 2015 of government, they had to basically encounter these different ministries and these tools that are located in different ministries who had different sort of cultures and ways of thinking about what the proper role of the state is. For instance, on finance with indirect tax credits. And I said a lot of the interviewees on either side of that divide sort of expressed a little bit of frustration with the other side. So I said, saying, finance is too suspicious of direct programs and they're too protective of SHRED. So even in 2017, when the Treasury Board review of innovation spending occurred, I said interviewees would complain, why is SHRED not included in that? We have the data on both sides. So even the program evaluation, interviewees felt was sort of too siloed. And in trying to stand up the Innovation Superclusters Initiative and the Strategic Innovation Fund, there was sort of discussion amongst interviewees that finance was sort of willing to permit smaller steps, incremental experiments in these types of tools, direct grants in a targeted fashion, but not willing to go wholesale in that direction. And similarly, Innovative Solutions Canada, the procurement program, had to be relocated from PSPC to ISED. So there were sort of departmental tensions in that. And then you see the slow uptake of across all departments in putting those procurement challenges up. So you're seeing this kind of ultimate result, which is layering. So yes, we've seen movement towards demand side procurement, targeted direct grants, but it's incremental on top of the existing policy mix. We're not seeing a big shift. And then business state coordination. So Canada has always lacked institutions for the state to coordinate with the private sector on industrial strategy. And we've always lacked institutions to coordinate across government departments as well, to get everyone on the same page on these, what's the target, what's the sectors, what's the strategy. And so the economic strategy tables are sort of the latest example of this. So they were temporary forums that produced reports that were very valuable, but confidential interviewees sort of complained that this whole process felt a little bit ad hoc. These are 13 firms that participated. So they didn't feel like it was part of an ongoing larger industrial strategy. They sort of felt it was a little bit temporary with not enough follow-up. And specifically on the follow-up, one member of the Industrial Strategy Council complained that we haven't heard anything back after the report was released, and that was 2 years later. So there's this sort of sense that we don't have this permanent institutional forum to really get the business and the state on the same page, setting priorities, setting strategies, and then working towards them in actual working groups, not sort of talking shops that produce reports. That's kind of the takeaway of that. And then the final piece here is this last institutional feature of Canada, which is regionalism. So cabinet in Canada is very attuned to regional equality and regional realities. And so when you're trying to place large strategically targeted innovation bets in this type of country, it becomes difficult. So spreading the peanut butter is the phrase interviewees used a lot for this. And I wasn't prompting them for discussing regionalism. It just sort of came out naturally. And so we cannot afford to make big bets as an example. And the superclusters is kind of exhibit A for this. So the original sort of policy design, some interviewees described as really trying to bet big on some areas of strength. So originally, let's go for 1 to 3 superclusters. But then they described the process where that got extended to 5, 1 per region, because that would be sort of more politically viable. And so then some supercluster interviewees said, that's not necessarily, placing big bets, that's almost hedging your bets. And so then even within those superclusters, there's sort of pressure to further extend the funding across different sectors and not have them as perhaps concentrated on sector problems as they could be. So that's kind of, again, that impulse to spread the peanut butter. And then the other side of the regionalism institutional reality in Canada is that of that small part of the policy mix that is direct funding, so not R&D tax credits, but is actually more available to target certain things, you have this sort of regional lock-in that occurs. So think things like Quebec aerospace, Ontario automotive, these sort of legacy sectors that have long received this direct funding. It's difficult to move away from that, the interviewees say. And that's sort of political realities, but also just the level of familiarity within the institutions of the state and the knowledge flows, sort of the proximity to those sectors. So it's hard to basically be nimble with that small fraction of the policy mix to put it into emerging sectors. And you see this with the sector allocation of the SIF funding, the 6.8 billion that has been allocated. Advanced manufacturing is definitely one of the largest recipients and largest applicants as well. And this is not to say that SIF didn't broaden to other ICT sectors, health, et cetera. It did. But the point is that the center of gravity, so to speak, politically is regionally is in these legacy sectors of Ontario auto and Quebec aerospace. And you see this with the Technology Partnerships Canada funding going back to 1997 to 2006. I sort of had to manually sort this based on the data that was available, but you do see that aerospace has long been that focus, and then still in Quebec and Ontario as well. So you have these sort of tensions institutionally at trying to pivot to different targets. So you always have to remind yourself as a whole, we're not very targeted in our innovation policy mix because SHRED is 75% of the R&D spend versus 25%, which is through direct grants. And then even within that 25%, a lot of that is allocated in a sector neutral fashion. And then even the smaller portions where we do actually target things, it's sort of regionally locked into these areas. So you have these institutional realities bearing on the innovation and skills plan, in its effort to try and reorient the innovation policy mix towards direct grants and contributions in a targeted fashion, and also employing demand-side procurement, the way a lot of other countries have a long experience doing. So this sort of raises these three institutional sort of realities that are specific to Canada. And I talked about them already, but this, weak interdepartmental coordination mechanisms to overcome siloed resistance to these types of approaches, impermanent institutions for state industry coordination, and then this Westminster regionalism that frustrates the consensus on targeting innovation investments in emerging sectors. So really the contribution here, I know I'm at time, the contribution is to the politics of innovation policy. Innovation policy is a field that a lot of economists, not enough political scientists look at, and specifically trying to reorient or change a country's innovation policy mix encounters and exposes the sort of path-dependent and political reality of this policy space. It's not merely a technocratic exercise of picking this, pulling on this lever or that lever. There's path-dependent kind of frictions involved. So I welcome any feedback, questions. Feel free to email me here, travis_southman@carleton.ca.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Travis. That was great. I've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A, but I'm going to kick off the discussion with a question of my own to start the ball rolling. There was a very interesting story in the press this week about the announcement of the new Volkswagen battery plant investment in Southern Ontario. Both the federal and the provincial ministers noted that they worked very long and very hard to attract the investment from Volkswagen into southwestern Ontario. But there was a very telling comment in the story I read. One federal official who was involved in the negotiations said it took them longer to obtain interdepartmental agreement on all the components of the support for Volkswagen, the Volkswagen investment, than it took them to obtain the agreement from Volkswagen itself as part of these negotiations. Why do you think, and that's a story that we've heard over and over again. Why do you think it is so difficult to do that within our federal public service? And what do you think the prospects are of that changing anytime soon?
I'll jump in. So I also think it's specific to the magnitude of this investment. So to match the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act tax credits on battery production, there's estimates that we've done as part of the work with the Transition Accelerator in my postdoc, which basically puts it at almost $2 billion a year per factory of that scale of the Windsor Stellantis factory, for example. So this would just be a massive investment over 10 years, $20 billion, almost on scale with the auto bailout. So I could see that being contentious, trying to work within the departments to get everyone on the same page for that. And I also think, secondly, I think it sort of matches with some of the things I heard in my interviews, which is basically without an overarching strategy and a cabinet committee or some sort of PCO office that is really lining everyone up in line on every department's policy tools in that same direction towards that agreed upon strategy, things become a little bit ad hoc. And that's Atkinson and Coleman's reflection from 1989 as well, which is we just don't have these cross-departmental mechanisms to really craft a strategy to move all those policy tools that are housed in different departments in the same direction.
Okay, Shirley Anne?
Yes, well, certainly I agree with the notion that the interdepartmental policy tools are probably not as robust as they should be. Interestingly, at the beginning of the 2000s, it became very horizontal with numerous bodies and numerous committees, and the Conservative administration took the decision at that time to try and pull some of that a bit back because it was a bit unwieldy. So there's striking that balance. But what came out in my interviews as well was that there is this continuing coordination problem, not just on the mega projects that Travis has looked at, but on smaller efforts as well. Finding out that after they've been dealing with, on a smaller scale, a lab in one area, that work was being shut down and moved somewhere else, and it can come as a surprise. Interestingly, what I did find is those from the smaller provinces said the coordination within the federal house and amongst them with independent actors in the provinces was much easier. And they said they thought that getting people in a room together and hashing this out was a much easier exercise. Now that speaks to a bit to culture and approaches, but it came out as a continuing issue. And it is a frustrating one for all parties, for industry, for academia, and for government labs as well.
Okay, I'm going to move to the Q&A, and I'm going to be selective, and I will get to all the questions, but I'm not necessarily going to ask them in the order in which they were entered. Our colleague Dan Monroe says that two very interesting accounts of the limited impact of federal policy. What one takes away is that at best, policy intervention has been very limited, barely effective in moving the needle on innovation performance. Could a reasonable person conclude that policy isn't ever going to be an effective lever, that something more fundamental and beyond the easy reach of policy explains Canada's poor innovation performance, such as the industrial composition of the Canadian economy or our business culture? Or is there still a big role for a better, more focused policy? Do you want to lead off, Shirley Anne?
Yes, I'd be pleased to. Well, first of all, I certainly agree with a premise in the question that can there be other factors involved in this? What came out in the interviews was risk aversion, specifically when we deal with the venture capital market, perhaps in the more historical culture around that, but also as one, because I interviewed venture capitalists as well, also because we don't have the large pools of money to play with, so caution around that area. The industrial composition is an interesting one. I didn't look at that interplay, but that needs to be studied as to whether that is having an impact. But certainly in terms of a more traditional culture, which we have in this country, where there are these silos, Travis spoke of it as well, these silos between academics and business and even government labs, and the inability to cross that. That said, however, I do think, and I think what the case study on AI, even with its limitations, and what the venture capital on startups show is that policy, not shocks, but input, whether it's over a very durable period or it's at key points in time that extends the evolution of that impact, can have import. And that's why I did the case studies, because it gives us that insight into causal sequencing. So I don't think it's that policy is unable. I think that the historic trends have been such that we've been focused on this upstream activity, and the efforts of commercialization have been given, I think, more short change over the years.
Travis?
Yeah, I completely agree. The focus of the policy mix has been relatively stable and really emphasizing higher education spending. I think that's important, and to keep up with the OECD, we need to continue doing that. It's just that we need to do order of magnitudes more on the commercialization front. I think the policy story here is that more to be done. But I do also agree with other observers structurally in the Canadian economy. Bruce Martin, his book "Sleep at the Switch," really hammers this home, which is we have this technologically sort of dependent branch plant structure, which makes it harder to do domestic R&D if a lot of your firms are not really sort of growing to a certain point as a Canadian firm and really taking it for globally if it's kind of more of a branch plant economy. So there's these structural concerns flagged by the Science Council of Canada, back in the 70s and 80s. And then there's, other sort of factors. There's the sort of Jim Balsillie kind of school on this, which is, business expenditure on R&D is actually a symptom of lack of policy focus and business focus on intellectual property protections, IP patents, and freedom to operate globally in different markets. And that includes things like standards as well. So if companies don't feel that they have the protection on their inventions, they're not going to invest as much money on R&D. So that's kind of an outcome of not focusing enough on intellectual property protection, both on the policy side and the business side. And then finally, there's the Nicholson argument, which is that Canadian businesses have been quite profitable in this low innovation equilibrium. The Council of sort of the low innovation equilibrium. So they don't need to invest in R&D. And I don't disagree with any of those takes. I think they all tell part of the story. And I just think our work on the policy side, telling that story hasn't quite entered the conversation to the level of detail that I think both of our work provides.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. Ezra Miller, long experience in the federal public service, asks, in his experience, there's a lack of understanding of science and technology and innovation among the senior mandarin in Canada. Only Quebec provincial senior officials seem to get the importance of, consistent importance over time of focusing on science, technology, and innovation policy. Did you find this as an issue or problem in your research, and what evidence, one way or the other, Shirley Anne?
So it didn't come out strongly in my interviews that there was this less focus on it by senior federal officials, although I do want to acknowledge the very at times visionary work that certain steering councils on AI in Quebec and areas that have fed into their budgets and decision-making documents, because I had looked at that for AI, have had, and the import of that. So I want to acknowledge that. But it didn't strongly come out. What did come out, though, was the challenge of translating the very technical world, and I've kind of lived in labs for a while too, of that world into decision-making understanding at the senior levels and at the political level. So I do want to make that comment. But the other part of this is, as the exercise in the priority cycling shows, it wasn't that it wasn't a priority, or that S&T or that research prowess weren't areas that weren't important, not at all. Sometimes it was a bit faddish. They grabbed onto the Porter cluster stuff in the late 90s and went with that. But they've been open to a lot of advice over the years, and commissions and struck those. It is that it keeps moving, it keeps oscillating. And unfortunately, that is echoed to a certain degree in the budget oscillation as well.
Travis, are you good with that, or are you?
Yeah, my focus was more on the federal level. So, but I will say a lot of interviewees, I did do some interviewees in Quebec as well, and Ontario, more to get a picture of the federal policy process. But in the process of that, there does seem to be striking differences in the Quebec approach, sort of almost infusing nationalism to really, make a strategic targeted industrial strategy, and that's worth exploring. Someone needs to do a thesis on that one.
Okay, my colleague Darius Ornston says that you could argue there's a tension between Shirley Anne's call for greater consistency in priority setting, such as she found in the AI case, versus Travis's concern about lock-in as in terms of specific regions or sectors capturing funding. He's curious to know how the two of you would reconcile this apparent trade-off between stability versus flexibility. Do you see the same contradiction in your interpretations that Darius finds?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. Very interesting question. Certainly goes to the heart of both pieces of work. I'm not sure the tension is that strong. It is the scalpel you use with the policy tools that I think is important here. What we have seen is that there's been these historic trends, whether you pick it up in 2000 or you pick it up in 2015, that we can't seem to get out of this cycle. And some of the interviews said, even to Travis's point on the shred, businesses sometimes get into the cycle of drawing down on R&D funding through shred and not moving it into commercialization. So I think there is that concern with getting into those kind of pitfalls with respect to it. That said, I don't think that prevents using a very honed policy tools that can change this, such as dealing with the silos between business and academics and government labs. This idea came both from the academic side and from the business side. And it was that we should use industrial research at times, not in these very large expenditures, but rather like a library. If you need industrial expertise on an area and a firm, even smaller firms who have specific industrial needs, they should be able to reach in and get that for a period of time, a year or 2 years, but not 5 or 10. And that the flexibility that is needed for academic focus at times on these areas and industrial needs isn't there. That doesn't mean that we need to undercut fundamental science, but it does mean we need honed tools, and this oscillation between 3% on science 1 year and the year before it's 87% really is very challenging for both industry and for academics.
Okay, Travis?
Yeah, I think there is that tension, but I think really the story is not too different. So Shirley Anne talks about cycling of priorities over the years, the different strategies, which sectors are we targeting? That sort of oscillates and expands over the courses of governments, and then a new government comes in and says, okay, we're going to just focus on this, and then that kind of expands. So the priority sectors that we're targeting, it is a discomfort with saying we're really going to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 areas because we're a small country and we're going to really go at scale and attack this. And I think that lends into the regionalism concerns of regional equality. Interviewees, government interviewees sort of said, well, as a government, we can't really say we're going to really dominate AI and 90% of this happens to be in the GTA. And so that's where we're going to focus our money. So even in those areas where we're sort of targeting more than we have in the past, there's still that tension that surfaces. Whereas in the background, you do see decade after decade, those regional plays in auto and aerospace, there's more familiarity and a comfort and putting the money there. So those emerging sectors are just hard to switch to.
Okay, that leads nicely into a question from David Tickle. He says, I get the negative impact of prospective investment, innovation investment on regional politics, such as in the case of the superclusters, but why is it problematic to focus investments on, regions that are sectorally strong, such as automotive in Ontario or aerospace in Quebec? Why do you see that as problematic?
Travis, I'll let you lead with that one.
So I don't see those as problematic. I think the gap in what we do in business expenditure on R&D is just so massive that we just really need to go after all sectors where there's possibilities to really claim market share globally. And aerospace and EVs and automotive are definitely still in that category. They're high intensity sectors, good jobs, et cetera. The problem I see and my concern, particularly in this new phase, with the battery plants, if there's sort of a 2-step comfort level. So we're comfortable really putting a lot of money in these legacy sectors, but we're not necessarily as comfortable really going equally as large in other sectors that we don't have that historical background of giving money to. And so if 20 billion over 10 years goes into just one battery plant, imagine what that budget could do to the, Canada Innovation Corporation, which is only 2.6 billion over 4 years. So IRAP is great. And these sort of neutral approaches across sectors are great. But there's just that overall in the policy mix, we really do focus on innovation spending being neutral across the sectors with SHRED and IRAP. And then we have these almost exceptions when it comes to things like the auto bailout, or locating a battery plant where the same rules don't necessarily seem to apply, and we're more comfortable going at a higher magnitude of funding.
So I have a somewhat different aspect of the evidence that kind of came up through the interviews for me. I made a very concerted effort in this research to look at regional voices as well and smaller areas of the country. And it's an interesting point, and it doesn't undercut other aspects of this. But there was a concern, particularly with the superclusters, that they started from a kind of brand new slate, and that the actually very interesting work that is happening and innovation that is happening in pockets of the country were being overlooked as that kind of larger approach. And it was a regional approach that was put in place. And so the argument that came up is that we tend to always pull to the metropole. And so that may be needed in large sectoral areas, but there needs to be some awareness of some very valuable work that's happening in other areas of the country. And it was interesting because in the early period, 2001, the innovation cluster approach and the approach that was rolled out by the Chrétien government very much took into consideration that local aspect needed to at least be considered. The challenge back then, and it continues, is that it doesn't get integrated in any way. It just kind of swirls around on its own. But I think there is a consideration there that needs to be taken into thinking about it.
Okay, Ron Friedman makes an interesting point. Most of Canada's underperformance on bird can be put down to the disappearance of our large R&D performers who typically accounted for 80% of birds, such as Nortel or BlackBerry companies spending $1 billion or more. Have either of you looked more closely at the performance of the missing, how much does the loss of those large R&D spenders influence the overall trend line, the downward trend lines that both of you documented in your presentation?
So if I may start, to that point, I didn't do a specific kind of look at bird with respect to that specifically. But what the pharma case shows clearly, and it's only on that area that I tracked it, not in terms of total bird, is this really precipitous decline in terms of investment to a level for R&D that was below 1988, as well as on patents. So you can see that playing out when there isn't that R&D maintained by larger MNEs. But as to the question as to whether that is the kind of fundamental dimension underneath this, when you look at and it's in the thesis, when you look at bird in the American case, it is not the leader in terms of on that. It's more Israel or Korea or countries like that. So to what degree that is the only explanatory factor or the key one, I couldn't address that. What I can say is when you look at these four conditions that I studied, and particularly with the strength of the overview of the case studies, that it does say that those conditions are critical as well on the bird side and to the overall impact.
Okay, we're running down on time. I'm going to try to squeeze two more questions in, so I'd ask you both to be really concise. Derek Eaton has three. Apologies, Derek. I'm going to be selective of your three questions. Derek says, working in Europe for many years, there's a common practice in most countries and certainly at the level of the EU to conduct periodic, consistent, independent evaluations of innovation policy and its goals. Does Canada have sufficient, regular, critical, independent reviews of innovation policy, that can guide and steer what it's doing?
I'm going to be very brief. No. We have slices into it, like in the commercialization vehicles, when those centers were set up, and they showed very positive results, and yet it was still wound down. An integrated approach on this has not been a consistent aspect. There was a quick period of the Harper administration where it was experimented with, but other than that, no.
Yeah, I think, both interviewees in finance department and I said agreed in my study that program evaluation as on a policy mix level, comparing SHRED versus the Treasury Board's effort in 2017 on direct programs, those could have communicated better. So no, there's work to be done for sure.
Okay, last question. and I've lost who asked it, but it was on my list as well. Our colleague Dan Bresnitz, co-director of the IPL, spent 18 months working with finance and ISED to craft the new Cana-dian Innovation Corporation. We're very early stages. We don't know who the CEO is going to be. We don't know, exactly how it's going to operate. But one of our audience is asking you to speculate on whether you think the new CIC will be more effective in moving the dial on innovation policy performance.
I'll be very brief. Certainly in my reading of it just recently, in terms of the document that came out, it has all the key players on the industry side lined up for this. And it has focused on a number of dimensions and programs and is very much going to function as a key hub for this. So I think those are very telling aspects for progress in the future. And interestingly, in my own interviews, the Clean Growth Hub was very useful for folks. The one thing I will quibble a little bit with is whether it's connected enough to some of those past initiatives like superclusters, and that lattice work that needs to be in place should be there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very promising. It's independent, so it can fly a bit under the radar, be more experimental. I think evidence from other countries shows that that's really helpful. And maybe it might be able to target certain things that are harder to do if cabinet level decision making is involved, like the Strategic Innovation Fund. But my concern is there going to be a degree of targeting that it is able to do, or is it going to be neutral sort of across all sectors, spreading its $2.6 billion over 4 years across all sectors, kind of the way IRAP does. So IRAP's sector interested, but it doesn't really concentrate on areas. So the magnitude of scale compared to the Canada Growth Fund of $15 billion that's going towards net zero and industrial policy is just a lot smaller. And so the question is, between those two vehicles, who is going to knit together the private sector on a roadmap, sector by sector, for net zero industrial policy, and then knit together all the policy supports across the different government departments moving in that same direction? Maybe that's a job for the Canada Innovation Corporation. It's less about the money, but more about actually knitting together those sector roadmaps. Time will tell.
Okay, there are more questions. We are out of time. If you posted a question and I didn't read it out, I apologize. If you send me your question, david.wolfe@utoronto.ca, I will forward it on to Travis and Shirley Anne to answer you directly. There was a question about whether the recording for this session will be posted. Yes, there is a Monk School and IPL YouTube channel. It will be posted to that fairly shortly, and we will include it in the next, the link for it in the next issue of the Innovation Policy Lab newsletter that will come out on April 1st. So I want to thank Shirley Anne and Travis for two very insightful and very informative presentations. I want to thank the audience for tuning in and joining us today, and I want to thank those who put forward questions for some very probing and good questions that put our panelists through their paces. Thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.